So Ernst Haeckel's tree of life remains without that missing link between apes and humans. But what about that first organism he placed at the bottom? He identified an organism at the very bottom of his tree called a Monera. Have scientists ever found that very first organism? Evolutionists claim that that spontaneous generation happened at some point in the distant past, that a cell spontaneously came into existence. In a letter written in 1871 to a botanist, Joseph Hooker, Charles Darwin suggested a natural origin of life in a, quote, warm little pond. He said this: "It is often said that all the conditions for the first production of a living organism are present, which could ever have been present. But if, and oh, what a big if, we could conceive in some warm little pond with all sorts of ammonia and phosphoric salts and light, heat, electricity, etc. were present, that a protein compound was chemically formed, ready to undergo still more complex changes. At the present day, such matter would be instantly devoured or absorbed, which would not have been the case before living organisms were formed." Well, this is what they believe, and so this is what they teach. However, the theory of spontaneous generation was conclusively laid to rest by Louis Pasteur, shown here. Now, Louis Pasteur was a tremendous scientist. He was a devout Catholic and the founder of both microbiology and immunology. His discovery that most infectious diseases were caused by germs is one of the most important in medical history. He went on to discover several and isolate several disease-causing organisms. He isolated Staphylococcus, that gives rise to staph infections, Streptococcus, that gives rise to strep throat, and Pneumococcus, that gives rise to pneumonia. He also developed vaccines for many diseases, including cholera, anthrax, and rabies. Well, what he did to disprove spontaneous generation was part of a contest, an experiment that was put on due to a contest that was put on by the French Academies of Science for the best experiment either proving or disproving spontaneous generation, the origin of life. And then this was in the year 1859. Coincidentally, the same year Darwin first published his book on the origin of species. Well, in this winning experiment, what he did was he had this little flask, which is called a gooseneck flask, that he put meat broth in and boiled it until it was sterile. Well, the neck on this flask was bent so that nothing from the air could fall directly into the broth, but was open to the air. It was not corked. And after sterilizing the broth, after several days, nothing grew. Nothing appeared in the broth. No bacteria, no fungi, nothing sort appeared in the broth. But then he tipped the flasks so that the media inside could flow up into the bend of the neck and then flow back into the flask. And within a day, it started to become cloudy, and bacteria and fungi began to grow in the media. So with this simple experiment, Pasteur had refuted the theory of spontaneous generation to all, and convincingly demonstrated that microorganisms are everywhere, even in the air. This was a world-renowned experiment, again put on as part of a contest by the French Academies of Science. Well, although Pasteur had conclusively refuted spontaneous generation almost 20 years earlier, Ernst Haeckel continued to advocate for its belief on purely religious grounds. He said this in 1876. Louis Pasteur's experiment was in 1859. He stated, "If we do not accept the hypothesis of spontaneous generation, then at this one point in the history of evolution, we must have recourse to the miracle of supernatural creation." Haeckel chose spontaneous generation, although there was no empirical evidence for it, and in fact, it had been conclusively disproven because he did not like the alternative, belief in God. Then, in 1883, 24 years after Pasteur's award-winning experiment, Ernst Haeckel committed another act of fraud to prove that life arose spontaneously on Earth. He claimed to have discovered the existence of the first cells he called monerans, and described them as being very primitive protocells that are, in his words, not composed of any organs at all, but consist entirely of shapeless, simple, homogeneous matter. They're nothing more than shapeless, mobile little lumps of mucus or slime consisting of albuminous combinations of carbon. But where did Haeckel see these cells? He worked it again at Jena University in Germany, which was home of some of the finest microscopes available to the day. And you would have assumed he would have seen these, but he hadn't, except in his imagination. Such cells, such simple cells, are a theoretical necessity for the theory of evolution, but not something that has ever been found. However, this did not stop him from making more than 30 drawings of these imaginary moneurons, which along with 73 pages of speculations were published in a prestigious German scientific journal. He also gave them scientific names. One of them he called Proto-Amoeba primitiva, because a primitive amoeba had to come before the real complex amoebas like we have today. So I guess why not just go ahead and make it up until it is discovered, perhaps, he was thinking. But the extent of the detail in these drawings and in his text is the real measure of his fraud. He had never seen these cells, and yet look at the details in these drawings. So, to reiterate, after proposing this tree of life, this evolutionary tree, Haeckel subsequently fabricated both the top and the bottom. The fact is, those proposed organisms, that first abiogenetic cell, and that missing link between apes and man never existed. They are complete fiction. George Wald was awarded the 1967 Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine for discoveries concerning the visual processes in the eye, and openly admitted to a belief in the impossible that life arose spontaneously because he could not accept the alternative, and that was creation. In the article, Wald went on to write that the hero of the origin of life was time. Since life had billions of years to develop, what we would consider impossible is virtually, quote, virtually certain, and that, quote, time performs the miracle. He furthermore expressed the view that it was just a matter of time before RNA, DNA, and proteins would be created in a laboratory by simulating Earth's early atmospheric conditions. Wald's expectations, however, were never met by scientists despite an enormity of effort. The most famous experiment, in fact, attempting to solve the mystery of the origin of life was conducted in the 1950s by Stanley Miller and Harold Urey. They sought to demonstrate how the building blocks of proteins, what we call amino acids, could form under natural conditions by creating a simulated theoretical atmosphere and a water cycle of the Earth. Their apparatus was equipped with a port where they could input some materials. They input methane as a carbon source, ammonium as a nitrogen source, and hydrogen and some water vapor with a boiling flask of water. A chamber was added to supply sparks of electricity, a condenser to promote chemical reactions, and a collector. From the apparatus, they succeeded in isolating 2% amino acids from what was mostly toxic sludge, but they did manage to isolate some amino acids. There were, however, several problems with the Miller-Urey experiment that are rarely noted by advocates of spontaneous generation. Now, again, they were supposed to be creating a model of the Earth's early atmosphere, but one main component of our gases was intentionally excluded. Can you spot what it was? They put in methane, they put in ammonium, they put in hydrogen gas, and they got some water vapor. What's missing? Yeah, oxygen. It was not even included as carbon dioxide. That's because oxygen is a gas that oxidizes or removes electrons from organic and inorganic compounds. Every good biochemist knows that amino acids will not form in the presence of oxygen, and if amino acids are present and exposed to oxygen, it will break them down. Thus, oxygen was excluded from this experiment, and it was assumed by early scientists that advocated for spontaneous generation that the early Earth must have had a reducing atmosphere or non-oxygen atmosphere. However, it has been shown now for decades that this was not correct. All the way back since the 1980s, it has been shown that the Earth has not had a reducing atmosphere, a non-oxygen atmosphere, due to the presence of oxide minerals in even the deepest of Earth rocks. This is from the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society in 1982. Geologists, they say, know from their analysis of the oldest known rocks that the oxygen level of the early atmosphere had to be much higher than previously calculated. From the journal Geology in 1982, they say there is no scientific proof that Earth ever had a non-oxygen atmosphere such as evolutionists require. Earth's oldest rocks contain evidence of being formed in the presence of an oxygen atmosphere. Well, despite this massive fundamental problem with the Miller-Urey experiment, the results continue to appear in literally every biology textbook that discusses evolution. For instance, Prentice-Hall Biology is arguably the most widely used biology textbook used in U.S. public schools. They say this: the Miller and Urey's experiments suggested how mixtures of organic compounds necessary for life could have arisen from simpler compounds present on the primitive Earth. But this is simply not true. The experiment did not produce anything resembling mixtures of organic compounds necessary for life. It is a well-known fact that the majority of the really important organic compounds, like proteins and DNA, have building blocks that exist in only one of their two possible forms. This experiment produced a racemic mixture of molecules, which is what we would expect in any kind of natural formation. However, the amino acids used to make proteins are only in the levorotatory or left-handed form. Also, the ribose that's in both DNA and RNA only exists in the dextrorotatory or right-handed form. Now, numerous theories have been offered over the years in an attempt to explain how a pool of molecules could form naturally that favor one form over the other. Most usually argue that it formed on crystals or in a clay, some kind of charged substance. But none of these experiments have ever been able to produce even a slight advantage of one form over the other. The truth is, all attempts to explain a natural origin of life are completely vacuous. Although Darwin and his contemporaries assumed the cell was very simple, today we recognize that the cell is vastly complex. It is an object of unparalleled complexity. So complex that drawing an analogy from our experiences is difficult. Our marvels of modern technology pale in comparison to the complexity we find in the cell. The cell contains orders of magnitude more moving parts than any of our marvels of modern technology, like a jet airplane. Even a Boeing factory does not even come close to the complexity. A cell is truly as complex as an entire city. It has, and in fact, several analogies we can draw with the city. It has countless molecular machines, factories full of machines. In fact, some of these we call these organelles, like the mitochondria, chloroplast. It has a central library of information and a system to distribute that information where needed. It has an infrastructure, like our roads and bridges, called the cytoskeleton, and highways that self-assemble, and armies of delivery vehicles carrying manufactured goods where needed. The cell is truly unparalleled in its complexity and adaptive design. Numerous molecular machines have now been discovered, like this kinesin, a little walking robot carrying a package of manufactured goods down one of the highways of the cell. These simply could not evolve through Darwinian mechanism. They are what we call irreducibly complex. They will only function when every part is present and assembled, and therefore cannot be constructed over successive generations in a Darwinian manner. Like the kinesin shown here, which again, a transport protein, or the ATP synthase shown here. This is a turbine engine that is composed of 500 separate protein subunits. It is a tiny molecular rotary motor that spins driven by proton motive force, is driven by protons, a flow of protons through it, rather than a flow of electrons like we use in our machines. It is of such importance, this molecular machine, that the discoverer was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1997. Or the flagellum, another important molecular machine. The flagellum is possessed by not just eukaryotes, the big cells, but also tiny bacteria. These are bacteria swimming around with what amounts to nothing short of an outboard motor. The flagellum is a nanomachine that is built using information from approximately 50 different genes and is composed of somewhere between 25 to 40 different proteins, depending on the species. It is the world's smallest rotary propulsion system. Everyone recognizes that these are machines. They are engineered, but they refuse to acknowledge what that implies. Behind something that's engineered, behind engineering, there's an engineer. Behind something that is designed, there's a designer. It is the world's smallest rotary propulsion system. In fact, it has all the parts that we place in our motors. It is constructed of proteins instead of metals or alloys or even plastics like we place in our machines, but it has a rotary motor. It has other proteins that serve as a bushing, others serve as the drive shaft. There's a rotation switch regulator, a universal joint, and it's got a helical propeller. Well, in The Origin of Species, Darwin said this: if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down, but I can find out no such case. Well, molecular machines are just that. They are irreducibly complex, cannot be built in a step-by-step manner over multiple generations. Their discovery should have caused Darwinism to absolutely break down, just as Darwin said. Not just break down, but absolutely break down. But instead, they turned a blind eye to them, refused to acknowledge what they imply, and continue to teach their ridiculous theory as though it's an absolute fact. But the biggest problem facing evolutionists in explaining the origin of molecular machines is not their irreducible, complex nature, but rather that blueprint instructions are required to make them. The instructions for the assembly and use of proteins in cells is contained within the molecule we call DNA. Now today, everyone acknowledges that DNA is specified information. Even Bill Gates said it's by far the most sophisticated program around. Well, the fact that DNA is coded information causes it to stand as the single most powerful argument for intelligent design that exists. Because in all human experience, information invariably has only been found to originate from a mind. And since intelligence is the only known cause of specified information, the presence of such information systems in biology should point definitively to a designing intelligence behind life on Earth. When it was discovered that information governed the biological world, it should have led to the conclusion that DNA was also the result of an intelligent mind, because that's how science is supposed to work. You're supposed to use your past knowledge and experience to inform your observations and reach a conclusion. In all past human experience, information's only been found to come from an intelligent mind. When information was discovered to govern the activities of cells, it should have led to the conclusion, or at best, the hypothesis, that the cell was the result of an intelligent mind also, because again, that's how science is supposed to work. But despite the overwhelming evidence of design found in cells, a person dedicated to their atheistic worldview will deny the obvious implications of those discoveries. Francis Crick was the co-discoverer of the DNA helix. He was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1962. He admits to seeing evidence of design, but states this: biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. How often must they remind themselves of that? Constantly. There's such overwhelming evidence of design in biological systems that a biologist that wants to hold on to their atheistic worldview must constantly remind themselves that what they see was not designed, meaning not created, but rather evolved. Well, to make matters even worse for the advocates of spontaneous generation, or the abiogenetic origin of life, not only is DNA required to make protein machines, but proteins are required to make DNA. They are interdependent and could not have developed as a result of numerous successive slight modifications as Darwin envisioned. They must have appeared simultaneously to form an integrated system of what we call gene expression. The truth is that spontaneous generation theories were and are today something that has almost zero direct supporting evidence. Klaus Doss is the director of the Institute for Biochemistry at Johannes Gutenberg University in West Germany and is considered today one of the foremost experts in the area of molecular evolution. He states this: more than 30 years of experimentation on the origin of life in the fields of chemical and molecular evolution have led to a better perception of the immensity of the problem of the origin of life on Earth rather than to its solution. At present, all discussions on principal theories and experiments in the field either end in stalemate or in a confession of ignorance. But despite the enormous challenges brought about by discoveries in molecular biology, evolutionists continue in their belief that a cell spontaneously generated at some point in the distant past. A view that has been upheld from the beginning for purely philosophical, meaning religious reasons. Franklin Harold, shown here, is a professor of microbiology at the University of Washington and states this unequivocally in his book, The Way of the Cell. Life arose here on Earth from inanimate matter by some kind of evolutionary process about 4 billion years ago. This is not a statement of demonstrable fact, but an assumption almost universally shared by specialists as well as scientists in general. It's not supported by any direct evidence, nor is it likely to be, but is consistent with the evidence we do have. It's consistent with the evidence that we do have. But, ladies and gentlemen, the only evidence is that life exists. And because evolutionists believe there is no God, it must have evolved spontaneously.